Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar featuring guest presenter Jennifer Crandall from Safe Food en Route. We're also joined by Chris Reno from PJRFSI. Please note that everyone is going to be remaining muted during today's webinar. If you have any questions for the presenter or for PJRFSI, we encourage you to use the designated question tab within the GoToWebinar control panel, where there are also going to be some poll questions today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here as always. I appreciate Chris and the team letting me jump in and do some webinars and teach a little of the content that I'm very familiar with. So again, I'm Jennifer Crandall. Just a little bit of background about me. For those that don't know, Purdue Food Science degree. I recently, I've highlighted it because it's fresh. I just received the Purdue University Distinguished Ag Alumni Award for Food Science, and also the Outstanding Alumni Award for Food Science as well. So I'm really excited about that. I graduated in '98. I spent the next 8 years in manufacturing and dealing with a lot of the food safety quality different like just the different programs and stuff in place there. And then I spent 12 years at corporate Kroger, where a lot of my career developed there doing supplier compliance management, as well as what I call my 3-year detour into global sourcing. 6 years ago, this year, I founded Safe Food en Route. It's a food safety consulting company, and I'll expand a little bit more on what we do and how we started, but it's 6 years and growing and going strong. I've also been a board member on Land Betterment Corporation and on Omnibus Incorporated's board advisory of directors. And so I've been doing that for 3 years as well. One thing I do want to highlight that we just, 3 of my team members, myself as one of them, we have recently become Clockwork Certified Partners, which is an operational efficiencies program. And I'm really proud of that because it has a lot of Lean Six Sigma principles, but it's more catered to the small and mid-sized businesses that might not want to go into that robust management program. So we're certified coaches to it. So that's a really exciting new thing that we have since the last time I've done some of my presenting here. So let me talk a little bit real quick, shout out about what Safe Food en Route does and why we are doing some of the things that we are with Perry Johnson registrars and trying to do food safety consulting and talk a little bit more about supplier compliance management and the FSVP processes. So number one, my time at Kroger, I learned and was trained as in FSVP, but also I call it Supplier Verification Program as well, SVP, so foreign supplier versus domestic supplier verification processes. And so that's our number one niche. That's what we do and help with developing solutions for that. We also do food safety consulting to all of the regulatory and GFSI schemes, as well as training and label reviews. And as I mentioned, that clockwork coaching, which is at the bottom of this. We also are dabbling some with software as a service with the A3S readiness assessment tool with Aperidasoft, and we're working on developing some things with QMS with NESIS as well, and that's all under that culture advisory group. That's one of our partners in Canada. We also do food safety diligence for the private equity space. So we do an assessment where we come in and assess the risk of the food safety management programs with different manufacturers and processors and determine, do they have a high risk or a low risk for a food safety incident, and share that with the private equity community during transactions. Okay, so now that I've told you a little bit about myself, I want to get to know you a little bit. So I'm going to turn over to Chris to manage the poll to get to know you and understand who am I talking to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer. So I know that you and I have done a few of these together, and this is always one of my favorite questions because, it really lets us know how to dictate some of the question and answer that's going to come up throughout today's presentation. So I'm going to launch this poll, and then we'll give you a brief minute or two to fill this out, and then we'll get started with today's presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So congratulations on the recent award, the Distinguished Ag Alumnus. Nice work.
Yeah, thank you.
Soften the blow for the basketball game, I'm sure.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit.
That was happening simultaneously. That's hilarious.
Sure.
Yeah, that was a sad day, that not seeing Purdue win it. But hey, we were there, and it's the first time in a long time, so it's still exciting.
It's a very good season. So we got just a few more seconds here, and then we'll get this closed.
Okay. I might need you to read me the results because I don't see them.
Perfect.
Oh, Chris's dog's coming into the presentation, which is quite all right. What do we got?
40% manager direct level, 37% food safety quality professional, and 14% other.
Okay. All right, so we have a good blended mix of people that are on the webinar, so welcome. I always like to know who I'm talking to just so that I can cater the conversation a little bit more to who is in attendance. So this will still be pretty high level. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but if you do have detailed questions, feel free to ask, especially if there's something specific to your program that you're looking into. So just a quick agenda, what we're going to talk about today. We're just did the introductions, got to know each other a little bit. We're going to do, I pulled some 5-year trend data off the FDA website. So I think it's a little bit interesting to look at some of the inspection trends. And then we're going to talk a little bit about supplier compliance, and then the FSVP requirements and how they kind of play into all of the other components. And then any other thoughts and considerations that I might have. So feel free as you're going through. I know some of the questions that come up often, is this going to be shared? Yes, the presentation will be shared. Harry Johnson will post that on their website afterwards. I think it takes a couple of days to be able to do that. So there will be a recording of it. But also, if you have questions, there's a question box that you can input that question into for us so that I can answer along the way, and Chris will be monitoring that. Okay, let's look at some FDA inspection trends. So this is just the past 5 years. I didn't include 2024 in the data, and I know it might be hard to read just because of the light print. But my biggest goal was to show that the number of domestic and the number of foreign inspections that have happened. And so for those that are joining overseas, when I'm talking about foreign inspections, I'm talking about people outside of the United States, so manufacturing facilities outside the United States. This is straight off of the FDA dashboard. So in the last 5 years, there have been just under 10,000 inspections in the food industry in the US. There's been nearly 1,300 overseas. And of those inspections, for the second chart, what you'll see is some of the different classifications that have happened. So just for, oh, I didn't mean to press that, I apologize. So for those that are looking at the definition, so an OIA, or I'm sorry, OAI, that stands for Official Action Indicated, and that'll be in the yellow. So I'm going to kind of go backwards on the key. The yellow is VAI, which is Voluntary Action Indicated. OAI is in red, which is at the bottom of the chart, and then the green is No Action Indicated, so that you can understand. So voluntary action means that the FDA is probably going to follow up on you. You do need to take action, even though it's not official. You don't have to have the communication the same. But with an official action indicated, you do have to respond to the FDA before they allow you to move forward with your processes. So of those inspections, so you'll see the 1,300 inspections and the 10,000 inspections, what we have is about 938 OAIs, which are official action indicated. And then 10,750 of those had voluntary action indicated, which that's why that one's the highest on the chart, right? So there were a lot that said you have to do something to improve before we come back again. And then the red line, there's still there's not too many that were official action indicated, but it still resonates with the amount. So I think that, if you look, it's about 700. So comparative, you can see some of the percentages. So I just think it's interesting to look at that data. The other data that I want to pull up is what were those citations about? So what you can see here, the common citations that were happening, the majority of them, and these are based on percentages, that 35.7 is the percent here, and that was the development of an FSVP program, which is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule. And then I have them in order, so they're kind of going around the bottom of the chart. 9.1% were based on pest control, 8.4% on sanitary operations and plant maintenance, 8.3 were on personnel, manufacturing processing controls was 7.9, equipment and utensils 6.8, which is about design and maintenance, sanitation monitoring 6.3%, plant construction design 6.2%. Whoops, I keep hitting my own computer, so I apologize. HACCP plan implementation 5.8%, and then hazard analysis 5.4%. One of the things I want to point out is a lot of the things that are not based on development of an FSVP program, but everything else is kind of in that GMP, good manufacturing space, and HACCP plan space. So those are programs that you know that are commonly getting citations against them. The other thing I wanted to do was show you what is showing up on the FSVP trends. And I did a similar chart with this one where I looked at, you know, what are the main components. It's still 53% of the citations that are associated with the, in the last 5 years with FSVP are related to developing the FSVP. It's still the #1 citation that is given is developing an FSVP after 5 years, which to me is very interesting because that's, I believe it went into effect in 2016 for historical purposes. So we're still 8 years out and still seeing that companies do not have even an FSVP program in place. Then we'll go through real quick evaluation and performance risk. So it goes the opposite direction, but similar process of like highest to lowest. You have the hazard analysis, which is written, that's 6%, established written procedures, 6%, that's just an SOP on your FSVP. So like we will talk through a little bit of these. The approved supplier procedures for the importer. So what does it look like? The process, again, that is very similar to establishing written procedures. You know, what is your SOP? The importer needs to have that as well. Hazard analysis of biological, chemical, and physical. So early on, the trends that I saw with FSVP related a lot to this before the FDA started holding companies accountable. So they were doing an enforcement by education, and they were still just focusing on like, do you have an FSVP or not? Now, as you see, they're starting to expand a little bit more about what they're requiring. And with hazard analysis, that was one of the components to the program whenever I decided to start Safe Food en Route that I was mostly focused on, because I noticed that companies, you need a qualified individual that is preferably a preventive controls qualified individual or somebody who has extensive food safety background to be doing the hazard analysis of the food. There's a historical perspective of it, of like how they're performing and what types of trends are common with that food, but actually doing a hazard analysis and then a risk assessment, are they managing that hazard, is very critical components and usually takes a technical expert to be able to do that. And that was a big gap that I saw. So I'm not surprised to see this as something that shows up on the FSVP trends. Supplier approval document is also there, and then verification before the import, verification frequency, like once you decide to start doing verification, the verification frequency. So the requirement of the law is that you have to do this every 3 years. It's common, you have to keep the paperwork for 2 years. So there's certain things that you have to do, and then what is the actual verification activity? So just looking at those trends, you can see that the FDA is definitely looking more robustly at FSVP in that process. I still go back to a comment that I used to make often, is that FSVP is just a really great supplier compliance management program. And so that's why I look at it from my perspective as if you have a good FSVP program, you should have a good supplier compliance management program and vice versa, because you should be looking at all of these things as a processor, as an importer, as a distributor. You should understand the hazards associated with the foods that you are bringing into your facilities and that you're selling to your customers. All right, so now let's jump into a poll question about, do you have a formal supplier compliance program in place?
Perfect. So let's get this launched. Apologies about the background noise.
No worries. I always loved when dogs join us. It's fine.
You know, sometimes they just make an appearance and it's very brief and then it's over, hopefully.
Yeah.
So today it looks like we've got a pretty good breakdown. 63% currently polling at yes.
Okay.
And let's give it just another minute or two here to collect responses. And let's get it closed. So final numbers today, Jen, we've got 67% of the audience members do have some sort of supplier compliance in place. 27% yes, but it's not yet robust.
Okay.
So still looking for some answers.
Good deal. Well, that's a really good blend as well. I think companies are getting more, more proactive in supplier compliance management, and especially with FSVP. When you're looking at FSVP, it is, even though the trend is still that you need to develop it, companies are still much more aware because there's more presence of the FDA and regulatory aspect. But from a formal supplier compliance program perspective in manufacturing facilities, a lot of those manufacturers and processors already have that in place, which is good. But it is interesting that there's still just about a third of the audience that has one, but it's not as robust as maybe they would like. So we'll talk about that a little bit, what's commonly in a supplier compliance program. So first off, I want to talk about just like high level. I did a little bit of research, and I'm not, I want to do a disclaimer, I'm not an ISO standards expert, so I might have overlooked it, but when I did a really quick Google search on what are the ISO 9001 standards for 1500 standards that are in line with supplier compliance, what they brought up was these 4 buckets of supplier approval, which includes sometimes a standard, it sometimes includes some kind of certification, and then also looking from a business perspective of capacity, is the facility adequate enough to supply that product? And then there's usually a product quality component where you're looking at defects and making sure that companies are meeting the specifications that are expected for the product. And then a component of performance as well. So looking at how does that supplier behave? Do they have late deliveries with the company? How are they with their conduct with the relationship with the buyer planners or with the facilities that they're doing the deliveries? And then always, of course, one of the components is cost. So I bring all this up because what I see in large companies, there's commonly KPIs that are written around these. And depending on what department you're in, so what I saw in, when I was at Kroger, a lot of the focus was on like on-time delivery. There's sometimes for many companies, not just Kroger, but there's usually an incentive or a disincentive, I should say, for having on-time delivery if you're delivering in full. So there might be fines associated with it or deductions that they take off of your bill or later on. So they might not pay you, they might withhold that deduction in their payment and cite it. So then there's also a look at brand performance on shelf, like how's it doing on shelf and grading that, because they're promoting it, but you usually as a supplier have to promote it differently, and sometimes you build that into your bids. Also, customer complaints. So usually many manufacturing companies, processing facilities are looking at customer complaints as part of their supplier compliance management program. Again, quality, so are they meeting specifications, checking it, reviewing it regularly, et cetera. Food safety incidents outside of the relationship as well as inside the relationship, right? So do I have a recall going on now with this company, or have I had one in the past that they have caused? And have they had one with anyone else? So like if I'm looking at it from a retailer perspective, I need to know what's going on outside of our relationship just as much as what's going on inside our relationship, just because that's added risk as well. And so it's something that you want to pay attention to. But lastly, not just food safety incidents, but like looking at that a supplier approval program, looking at the programs that are in place that help support those food safety incidents to prevent them, right? So that's also part of the common KPIs as well. And then response time. So a lot of times you're graded on like, how fast can I turn around responses? If we do a mock recall, are they responsive? Are they giving me data that I need to have in order to make, have an effective mock recall, a successful mock recall, as we say, with that process. So it's all included in monitoring that, doing it KPIs, again, key performance indicators. All right, so I know I'm heavy with polls today, and I might get through this content rather fast. I'm just realizing where I'm at in the process, but go ahead and bring Chris back in to talk a little bit about it. So again, just asking a little bit more about what type of supply chain management program do you have? A robust software system to manage it. Do you collect data from all the suppliers in paper files? I'm not sure, it depends on who I'm talking to, right? Whether you have these programs in place or not, or, we need some help figuring that out.
Yeah, well, and that's why I like this question so much, because I'm seeing some of the early numbers come in here, and sometimes these polls really, I think, enlighten me a little bit. Sometimes you work with clients and they have software or they don't, and you see things in different sectors, and it sort of depends on who they're working with. So let me go ahead and close the poll and share these numbers. Okay. We have got 18% with they feel like a robust software. 74% are still collecting data from suppliers on paper files.
Wow.
And then we've got 6% not sure.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So the story is always, I think it's still surprising to many of us that consult or do some type of like offering in the industry for food safety, whenever we hear how heavy the people are responding with, we still have it on paper. It's like one of the key components, and I talk about that I'll talk about it at the end, but one of the key components to having a successful program is to have some type of automation, because when you're dealing with that much data, you need some type of automation to the process, whether it be triggers that are built into a software, some kind of food safety software that triggers you to take samples, that triggers you to sign off on things, that triggers the supplier to input data. There's a lot of options out there already, and that's one of the reasons that I've been exploring that and doing that with Safe Food and Root as well, with our offerings, because I want to make sure that companies understand how important it is to automate some of the high volume intake and outtakes of things that you are doing in the facility that need to be performed or done. It's so helpful to have those reminders. And you just think about, like, if I didn't have an alarm clock to remind me to wake up every day, so just something so rudimentary as an alarm clock to wake you up, that's a trigger to say, get up, get out of bed and go to work, right? If you don't have that, what happens? You might oversleep. Sometimes you might. Some people are easy to do that, but that's what you have to look at, like, so rudimentary in your food safety programs as well as all the other supplier programs as well. It's so helpful to have things that just triggers and reminders to do tasks. Yeah, so it's really a tool.
I completely agree, and we're in a very unique and great position as a certifying body that we don't have a software solution. That's really not our business. We're a certification body, and so we work with a lot of different providers. I see a lot of software demos, all the new things coming to market when we're at trade shows and things like that. So in your experience with some of the new rules around traceability and the USDA and FDA requirements with things like the organic program and the traceability and what we're seeing, kind of post Frank Giannis, do you envision customers being able to succeed in these programs, still keeping, paper copies and being able to track that much data back and forth?
No, I mean, and the focus I've had for my entire career has been kind of like the supplier level of documentation. And I know, at Chris is where I've shared this in different presentations in the past, that when I was at Kroger and I was just at my end days of Kroger, I was managing about 12,000 manufacturing facilities, and not managing, I shouldn't say managing, but I was monitoring the data from them. And so you think of all of the different things that whenever, especially if we have people who are on here that are suppliers to large companies, all the data you have to share to those companies and have to send over, and they ask for it. A lot of times they ask for it in an electronic system of some sort, right? Because they can't have you emailing all those documents, because it just sets off a trail of somebody needing to manually go and check to see if those documents are correct. Did you send in all of them? And so then there's this, like I used to say, it was a 12-week cycle of conversation. And that's if you had the right people that you were talking to and the right documents provided to you. So each time you would have like the send off of like, I got to send and ask for, these 5 documents right away. And that company might take a week to respond to me. Well, then I look at them and review them manually and determine, nope, they don't have everything, I need to go back. And so then there's another, and that took me the second week. So now you've got a 3rd week of conversation and so on. And it just continues to build. So the more volume that you have, it seems so easy to manage that type of data until you have to manage it and you only have one place to do it. So like to answer your question, and especially with the FSMA 204 rule and the organic certificate or the verification process that's come out, the new law, I'm not familiar with the title of it, not right now, but that new law that's associated with it as well, those requirements, you really need to have at least a centralized management location to put all those documents in. And it can't just be your share drive where you have a list, a repository of documents. You need to have information about each document that is sortable on a spreadsheet, and that can be exported out of it or sortable in a table of some sort. So yeah, I don't know how companies can actually manage all of this from the beginning of the supply chain to the end of the supply chain. And FSMA 204 is the most, to me, the most cumbersome of the rules that are coming out, because it's asking you to, you have to track all the information from the beginning of any product that's on that food traceability list, all the way to, from the origin of that product. So if you're talking about things that get manipulated, like fresh produce, where it might be cooled down, you have to have information there. You have to have information about the transport, the washing steps, if it's commingled with anything, and then if you do something with it. So you have to track the lot numbers, the volume, and there's several pieces of information you have to track. You have to be able to pull that all into a spreadsheet related to that one product that you might have shipped and somebody else created 7 other products out of. So it's like, it's so much data. There's absolutely no way to manage it in any other way. So I could go on for days about that. So I'll keep going. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about real quick, just a reminder of, like I mentioned, a lot of the things that were noticed in the citations for overall in the FDA trends, if you notice, a lot of them are covered here in our current GMPs. And so questions that you need to ask when you're doing supplier management is, how do I know that they are meeting the current GMP requirements with personnel, with plant and ground, sanitary operations, et cetera? I could read them all to you, but I don't need to. But like, how do I monitor that, and understand that they're meeting regulation requirements? And also meeting, I have FSVP written here next, and I mentioned the hazard analysis part and how critical that part is to have a certified person or a qualified individual that is actually doing the hazard analysis of the product for each supplier. So if you're buying, and I'll use an easy easy product, but like if you're using sugar, for example, and it's a, you know, I would say a lower risk item, right? But when you're doing the evaluation, you might have 2 different suppliers of that sugar or 2 different facilities. Well, they, you know, one facility might have something in the facility that it could be a chemical that is different from the other facility, and that could cause some cross-contamination in that facility. So that would be a hazard you need to review. So the hazard analysis is not just, this is, and maybe a better example is one that has allergens of some sort. But so like say you have soy and dairy in one facility, not the sugar example, obviously, but just using a different type of ingredient. So you might have dairy and soy in one, and you might have dairy, soy, and wheat in the other. And so there's an associated hazard that may not be listed on the FDA guidance document because it's not usually made in a facility that has wheat, or it might not show up on recalls as much as wheat, but wheat is clearly an allergen at that facility. And so your FSVP program, your supplier verification program, has to include those components for each facility, each product produced, and actually doing that full evaluation. And that's why you need a qualified individual to do that. And so these are the requirements of FSVP. Keep in mind, this is a good supplier compliance management program. So this is just required by the FDA, but I use it all the time. So doing a hazard analysis on the products and the facilities producing it, evaluate, are they mitigating that hazard? You have an approved supplier list. You have an established written plan, which means that you have an SOP basically, and you're following your SOP and have a form to fill out. You're verifying that they're doing it by looking at documentation or doing lab tests. There's a lot of flexibility with what the verification activity looks like, but it should be justified by science. So you need to know why you're verifying this step. So for that allergen step, how do I verify that they are controlling the wheat and not getting it in the products that I'm purchasing that don't have wheat in them? So are they running it on a different line? Are they running it completely separate buildings? Are they running it in order? They are like planning the order of the production so that wheat is ran after my product every time, and they're doing a clean separation of sanitation steps in between, and then they're verifying it by doing swabbing. So there's lots of steps and components to look at. Again, that's why a qualified individual needs to look at it. If they're not doing it right, you have to have corrective actions in place. So what are you going to do if they're not managing that hazard appropriately, or they need to improve their programs? What is the corrective action? So examples of things that we do, if we're reviewing it from documentation perspective, we might have them prove to us, like give us more data within a month to show us that they are controlling it, like tell us more about it, write it in your policy, add it in there, things like that. Also, you do a reevaluation. So there's a regular requirement for reevaluating. I mentioned earlier, every 3 years, you have to re-verify products that you import, and you have to keep that paperwork for a couple of years. That's part of the record keeping. You have to identify as FSVP importer entry. This is still, I'm still shocked at how many companies do not understand what FSVP importer means, especially after this amount of time. So conversations that I have with many companies that are doing the import, or they might be out of the country, and this is especially true with companies that are out of the country, out of the United States. So when you act, you have to have, according to the FSVP rule, you can be the US consignee or the US customer in order to put yourself as FSVP importer. So US, United States, is the key component there. You have to be in the United States. If there is not one of those, so in an instance where you're a foreign company from the United States and you are importing product and you are the customs definition of the importer, so you own the product all the way until it lands in the US, and you put it and store it in a facility. If that facility is a third-party warehouse and you own the product in it, and they are technically not US consignee or US customer, then you need somebody in the United States that is making sure that you're bringing that you are meeting US regulations for FSVP. that's when you hire a US FSVP agent to be able to act as that. Safe Food and Root does that. We're very selective who we do it with. But just saying, because sometimes I run into companies that don't believe that the law applies to them because they've been inspected by the FDA at their foreign site. And so they're like, we're okay. Or they've had a GFSI accredited audit. So one of the CBs has come in and they have audited against one of those schemes, and they have had the addendum in there that they're meeting FSMA regulations. That does not mean that you don't need to have that FSP importer. You still have to have that. You still need to pay for that service for somebody if you don't have a US customer that is taking that responsibility, or a US consignee taking on that responsibility. So I'll get off my high horse there. Just sharing some of the things that we ran into in our company. But let's, just continuing to look at that. These are ways that we do verification at Safe Food and Root, and it's ways that you could do it as well. So looking at the supplier performance, looking at the regulatory history with FDA or USDA. USDA items usually are not part of FSVP, so that would probably be exempt, but you still want to look at that relationship to the facility that's importing foods. Again, this could still be supplier compliant. So if it's a USDA approved item, you may still want to review that regulatory history. You want to look at the recall history. Have they had any recalls? Have they had any situations where they've done a voluntary recall? Has FDA forced a recall, which they're now allowed to do? Import alerts and warnings. So there's a lot of information on the FDA dashboard. You can look at the history as the supplier with your own company. So that performance again, or with other customers. I mentioned it's really important to understand, do they have food safety incidents with you? Do they have food safety incidents with other people? And you can look that up on a lot of information you can find publicly. Do you have any complaint history? How do they manage their complaints? Do they have complaint history with any other customers that they'd be willing to share with you? And then, of course, the heavy hitter for us, a lot of times we do, is reviewing the food safety audit history. So we read through the entire GFSI accredited audit reports. And like I said, these are just a few of the things. So there's a lot in that et cetera bucket. So, a lot of times we make recommendations for lab testing, depending on the hazards or proof in their documentation in the facility, and we might want to review their documentation a little bit more thoroughly, and sometimes there might be an off-site visit as well, and that's stuff that we recommend as well. So speaking of on-site visits, and I believe anyone that is associated with Perry Johnson Registrar and most of the attendees here are probably familiar with Global Food Safety Initiative, the GFSI standards, and this is one way that, this with having an accredited benchmark audit scheme that's globally recognized, a lot of times the findings that are here help you understand that food safety program even more. And there's so much information there from a supplier perspective that is not just food safety. You can understand the operations, you can understand the management commitment. So there's a lot of things that you can read there. It's still good to remember that GFSI, though intended to show ongoing performance, it's still just a snapshot of time. Apologies again. It's just a snapshot in time. So it's the day of the visit, it's the day of the desktop review. So it might indicate a few months worth of documentation, but it's not the performance all year long, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's still important to understand that this is just a snapshot, but over the years, you can see trends related to it. And when it's unannounced audits, sometimes that gives you a little bit more detail, but a lot of companies know and expect when their on-site audits are going to be, whether they're scheduled or not. And so they have a good idea and they are what they call audit ready. A lot of companies will try to be audit ready all the time though as a goal. So it's just good to have an extra set of eyes. And again, having that qualified individual that understands the product, understands the hazards associated with the product, understands the process to manage those hazards and the systems and SOPs that are in place So again, I just can't reiterate enough how important it is to have a qualified individual reading these, meaning a food safety professional and quality professional reading these audits. But you can get some of that information out of it. There's a lot of information in the summary of an audit telling you more about the company as well. I did mention on-site visits. So coming from a corporate background and just from personal experience over the last 26 years now, I believe, I think it's extremely helpful to go on site with every facility that you purchase goods from, regardless of whether it's raw material supplier or it's a co-man, whatever it is. GFSI is intended, one of the intentions of it was to be one audit accepted by all when it was starting to get really popular and some of the things that were pushed by retailers. But there is nothing that can replace going on site and actually looking over the full facility. And so I recommend companies visiting other companies that are, before they do business with them, if at all possible. That's just something that I think will help, because sometimes you can have a facility score very well, but they really don't have as robustly developed programs as you would like. And then there's also the opposite, where a company scores really low, but and not to take away from what the audits do. Again, the third-party audits are a helpful tool to use in your tool belt, but it's just knowing that, again, it's that snapshot. So if you do an on-site visit after somebody has done an audit and they scored low on it, and you walk through the facility, you might find that they have made all the improvements that they need to score high again on it later. So it's just good to go into that facility. And I suggest at least annually, if at all possible, to go on site, but certainly trending and looking and watching the companies through their documentation and their GFSI audits will help. So, all right, now this poll question that keeps my computer likes to advance forward. So I'll let Chris take over again. So how do you manage your suppliers currently? Are you using GFSI, or are you using a third-party food safety audit that's not GFSI? Do you require do you visit on site? Do you just do relationships and historical performance? None of the above, all of the above?
Yeah, so really early results. It looks like we've got around 80% currently that require GFSI accredited audit schemes, and 11% with third-party food safety audits, and a little less than 10% visit on-site. So let's give it just another few seconds to close here, and then I will share the results with you.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. And let's get them shared.
Okay. All right. So it looks like it didn't change. It's the same. So that's good that a lot of companies here are using GFSI to help manage them. And like I said, GFSI is a great tool, and because it's benchmarked and it has so many companies, like the process, and Chris, you probably can speak to it more than I can about the benchmarking process and how why it is such an effective tool. Because like the history of GFSI, for one, I mean, it's been around now for what, like 25 or 30 years at least?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I agree with you when it comes to the on-site versus off-site. There are a lot of tactile things, right? I know you've spent a lot of time in operations. Sometimes there's a smell, there are chemicals, there are all sorts of things that a consultant or an auditor might uncover on their visit that they wouldn't be able to see through just a webcam. And so I think if you are in a position where you're looking for a consultant, it's really important to let that consultant have all the tools really needed to help you get your facility squared away for whatever the standard may be, whether it's an upcoming GFSI audit or FSVP, forest and FSMA regulations.
Right.
I really just unless it's just something very basic and you have a question that can be solved online, I usually tend to say that on-site is always the best way to go. Now, if it's an ongoing relationship and you're 2 or 3 years down the road, I could totally understand where, a yearly, even semi-annual phone call might take care of it. But yeah, I think that's really eloquently put, Jen. And I think that, I guess I want to ask a question. With the numbers at 75% requiring the GFSI audited schemes, I know that for a long time GFSI has been sort of the benchmark, one size fits all, the one audit to eliminate all the other audits. Mm-hmm. Do you see that a lot of companies, now that we're 20 years in, are really using that as a way to say, hey, well, they've been checked, my responsibility is somewhat now at bay. I don't have to go any further because they are a certified site. So if there is a risk of a recall, I'm not going to be affected.
Yes, I have seen that kind of, almost want to say laxed behavior. What I will say is, it's a great tool to do like quick vetting of suppliers. So if you're doing a bid for suppliers and you look and you say, have they been GFSI certified, or do they have that audit? And from the retailer perspective, I can say that I see this a lot, where that deciphers if you move forward or not. So if you're a small company and you don't have GFSI, so one of the GFSI schemes, BRC SQF is most popular in the United States, and FSSC 22000. If you don't have one of those certifications, there's an initial gate that you will go through for qualifications at the larger retailers, and that is one of the first things they ask. All of them require it. And so if you're wanting to get in that private label space specifically, or in the produce, the meat department, whatever it might be, that's going to be one of their first areas of clearing. So it's a great tool for that. But from a liability perspective, and from FSVP, from preventive controls perspective, from the USDA, like, you are responsible for what information you receive from that audit. And so the liability doesn't just fall on the supplier anymore, but it falls on you to read that audit report and determine, what do I need to look at further? Are there any concerns here? What do you do with that information? And that's one of the things from a regulatory standpoint that's always critical. You can't just collect data and not do anything with it, which is another reason why FSMA 204 is a little scary when you look at it from that perspective, because now you're collecting the data. So that means you need to analyze, you need a trend, you need to collect the right data. A lot of the data that you're collecting for FSMA 204, I shouldn't say it's scary. A lot of it is going to still be factual data that's about that, and not, you don't have to interpret information on it, right? You might be looking at specifications to make sure that they have met your specifications, your certificates of analysis, that sort of thing. And that kind of follows item level data. But when it comes to supplier management, and a good example, and I'll just take us completely out of food safety, let's talk about social and ethical audits, right? So if you have an ethical audit and you find out that there's some kind of discrepancy or mistreating of humans of some sort, what are you going to do with that information? You can't just collect it and say, I'm not going to do anything with it. And I read the audit report and I find out there's slave labor, or there is some kind of child labor violation. You can't just sit on that. That's a brand, that's like a huge can of worms that you just opened. So it's the same thing with food safety. You can't sit on things when you learn about it. You have to take action. And that's a lot of times the food industry's been scared to be proactive in our approach, but the law requires that we're proactive now. So we have to. So you have to look at it. You have to interpret data. You have to trend it. You can't just collect it and put it in a file and say, I got it and I checked a box. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, it sure did. I think that's a perfect explanation. And again, I think a lot of it kind of comes back to the liability. There's a certain amount of it where it's corporate responsibility versus the liability aspect. And I think that's where we need to be really careful that yes, while you've done your due diligence, what is uncovered during that audit is still detrimental, could be detrimental to your bottom line. So always follow up after, regardless if a site's certified or not. I think it's important to ask the questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a perfect segue to just, I've quoted this before. This used to be something this slide, I used to have it hanging in my office at Kroger, and I'm pretty sure somebody at Kroger did give it to me. So William A. Foster was a Marine that died in the Battle of Okinawa in actually on May 2nd of 1945. And the story behind this quote, or story why it became popular, was because he jumped on a grenade to save his fellow Marines. Before that, obviously, he made a statement about quality, and I insert food safety here because I feel like quality and food safety go so hand in hand together, and oftentimes falls on, the same person or the same department. It's never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. It represents the wise choice of many alternatives. So in context here, quality and good food safety programs are your intentional choice. And that, my point with supplier compliance programs, QMS programs, and FSVP, food safety quality programs, they're always intentional. And that's another reason why I mentioned the operational efficiencies. Why did we get certified to do operational efficiency coaching as well as food safety? Because to me, it all blends together. It's all part of food safety culture, because it's intentional effort to improve, to get more efficient, to consider all factors within the company. So again, like I mentioned, automation, again, looking at some of those processes that could be automated, because I also have a firm belief of the right people, the right systems, and the processes, and then the right automation in place. These are things that you can do, that you can automate. It's not everything, but it's quite a bit. So supplier information, supplier food safety programs, product specifications, nutritional information and labels, raw material specifications and nutritional information. So it could be product finished goods, it could be raw materials, could be both, depending on what system you have. Monitoring and surveillance, those types of programs, that's all automated as well, or can be. Policies, procedures, digital forms. I love when forms are digital and create some kind of conditional situation. So like if I check this, it opens up this. And so that gives you your ability to build in your corrective action tools in there. So like if I'm out of spec, then I have to do this in order to correct it. Those are great systems to have in place. You also want to just consider about system integration, because a lot of this you can integrate to your ERP systems and help you manage your inventory as well, which is super important. And then another one that a lot of people automate is your training. So having, using tools that help you with automating training, or at least triggering. I mentioned the triggers earlier, just like what's your alarm clock for when am I due to have GMP training again with the entire company, with each person who onboards? When am I supposed to have allergen training? Who needs to have allergen training? Having those people and input that, again, that can, maybe that works with your SAP system, so that you have, some conversations around with your HR department of making sure certain people sign off and have certain types of training as well. So great things to do. It can be a way to help you manage things, get more efficient, save time and money on hiring someone full-time, on managing suppliers. It could help you manage those KPIs I was mentioning before. Could there be workflows or anything like that that could be built in? So for receiving information administratively, where suppliers might input data directly into your software, and then you have somebody on the front end that's triggered by some type of automation that tells you, I need to go review that document, or whatever it might be. So those are all considerations. There's so many options out there. There's a ton of them, and as Chris said, like we've seen a lot of them, and I stand behind that process and really feel like, especially with FSVP, supplier management, and mentioning FSMA 204, the organic regulation as well, all of those are beneficial to have some type of system to have in place. So that I'm going to conclude with today's presentation. I put our Director of Business Development's information on here if you need anything from us. Hebe she's more than willing to help you get started if you have any questions. Again, like all of our partners listed there. Again, thank you so much for letting me do the presentation. Chris, are there any questions that came in during the
time? Jennifer, thanks so much. Another great presentation. Actually, today we didn't have many questions. Some of them were answered throughout the presentation. So I just want to take a little bit and touch on something. So in the first poll, we had the guests identify themselves, and it was almost split down the middle, 50% being CEO or ownership level, and about 50% being QA managers and plant operations. So we've talked a lot today about automation. Can you give the 50% of the plant managers some tools, some keywords, some numbers even, to help them convince the other 50% to possibly look at investing in a new software platform? I know one of the things, putting it to numbers, that always makes a lot of sense for me is recalls. And you mentioned earlier with the new rule of forced recalls that they're allowed to do. Can you talk just a little bit about the recall, spend this last few minutes talking about the recall process and what that looks like in financial terms, for those customers?
Yeah, so I mean, like a lot of times whenever we're making decisions about software, we're looking at return on investment. But sometimes you need to look at risk mitigation as well as one of those choices. And, what does it take from my quality and food safety team? What do they need in order to efficiently do their job to prevent a recall? So I think that's a great way to look at it. And, average recalls now, my goodness, depending on the volume of the product and how it can interact in other ingredients, there's numbers out there of it being, $1 million to $2 million, and some even up to $10 million in costs and fees associated with it, depending on the breadth and how much it. And I could say, like, is a recall common? 100% is common, and it happens all the time. I get recall alerts. If you go to Safe Food and Roots page, every time I see a recall, I share it on Safe Food and Root page for LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, or whatever it is. It's X now, but I share it there too. But like I'm surprised on days that I don't have a recall, that I don't have a recall alert. So it's kind of like, oh, I just haven't seen the news yet, and then I find it a few days later and share it, and it was there. They happen regularly. Now, are they forced recalls from the FDA? Not always. They're usually discovered by the facility and they're voluntarily initiated, but they're initiated because the risk is high enough for a Sakota hazard, right? So like a severely adverse consequence or death associated health event. I know that wasn't the exact acronym for Sakota, but it's close. So like, yeah, the numbers speak for themselves on preventing it. So if you can prevent one recall, you're preventing the cost of $2 million, and the software that might cost less than $10,000 a year to manage, depending on what you're using. And so like if I had my choice, what to automate would be anything from a food safety perspective, anything that helps my team be able to automate things that are critical control points in the process, or the preventive controls. If it's something that needs to be measured, so temperatures, and then having some kind of automation. So like processing equipment has a lot of these automations built in, especially whenever it's related to pasteurization or kill steps or something like that. A lot of times the microbial hazards, the equipment associated with that is it's covering you pretty well, but it's the chemical hazards and the hazards associated with foreign material that also need to be automated. So like metal detectors or x-ray machines that do automated kick out. A lot of companies, foreign companies that we talk to, there are many that don't have x-ray machines or any type of foreign material control, metal detectors. And so that's usually something that we require whenever we talk to companies and comment on, because foreign material, I see metal shavings in food on the recalls probably 50% of the time. The other amount is usually allergen and label related. But if you look at certain areas also, it's Listeria and Salmonella, right? And those are a lot of times products that don't have a kill step that are associated with that. But sometimes milk, raw milk, and something like that. So I know I skirted around maybe the numbers, but
No,
like,
I think that's a really good start, because sometimes it's just, again, it's when it's not being quantified, it sometimes doesn't have the same impact for our owners and for our CEOs when they're looking at making these capital investments in something like an ERP or a software platform, to manage the traceability. So I think it's just really important to automate, some of the documentation and paperwork, and really free up the time for the QA professionals to, to really do what you're paying them to do, and make sure the quality's there, and make sure that everyone's adhering to the food safety culture and things around that. So
yeah, absolutely. And just to tie a little bow around that, or a ribbon around it, because I mentioned a lot of the processing things, and so when you're looking at it from a like supplier management perspective, it's, do my suppliers have those things in place? For the QA and food safety professionals out there, they are managing 90% of their job is paperwork. And the more that you can automate related to it, you can reduce the amount of time that they're dealing with administrative management of that, so that they can trend it. It's more important for them to interpret that data than it is to collect it. And I think that's like somewhere that it's so hard to even collect it and get the information. So anything that you can automate to collect that information reduces the burden on the person who's trying to trend it, because you're burying them in data instead of allowing them to trend it. That's something a lawyer does to people, right? In a defense, like, let's bury them with all the paperwork, make them have to review it all. Well, don't do that to your QA and food safety team. Instead, give them tools that will help them be able to interpret the data that's coming in, whether that be, getting the data entered by your suppliers, which puts a burden on your suppliers, yes, but at the same time, it allows them to give you the information in a way that maybe on a dashboard, your team member can trend it really quickly and be able to, advise appropriately, come in and say, hey, I'm seeing this trend going on. This is what I, suggest that we do. Or another tool also is to outsource, right? So outsource some of that to companies like us. I'm not saying Safe Food and Root, but if you do, that'd be great. But just saying, like, outsourcing, like, we do supplier compliance management, so let us trend it, tell your team member easily, here's what we recommend, so that your team member's not buried in that paperwork, but we're reviewing it for them on their behalf. So that's another way to automate it. It doesn't have to be computer and software. It could be just, I have, like, some people outsource their accounting activities, some people outsource their web design and other things. So it's just looking at it robustly of your whole system, like what makes sense to outsource, what makes sense to automate, what makes sense to keep in-house and administratively manage ourselves. And on that, I'm going to be quiet because it's 2:03 and I don't want to keep us too past the 2 o'clock.
Fantastic. Well, this is always my favorite day of the month. So, really appreciate your time today. Thanks to your team for all the hard work. And we will look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Appreciate it. Okay. Have a great day.